You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. Fuji is for artists, Sony is for pros. Now, off the bat, let's just say that there's not going to be anything definitive about this. This is all opinions, and you could argue either side of the issue. For the sake of the conversation, let's consider street photography, documentary, and landscape as the world of art, and nature, wildlife, sports, wedding, product, photojournalism as the pro world, with overlap. Joining us, Todd Verklempt, Sean Steiner, and Justin Dice, who are writers at B&H Photo as well as photographers, fine art and professional. So their opinions matter. We all know this stuff pretty well. Let's start off by talking to each of our guests what cameras they do and what they use them for. So, Justin.
Well, I shoot with a Sony a7R II mostly. I mostly do video work, but I do dabble in the photo realm as well. So that's my main camera. But I also do own a Fuji X100t that I use mostly for travel, personal use, and kind of just general street photography.
Okay. All right. Sean, what do you use?
I use a Sony a7R II for most things. Photo emphasis, but also a lot of video work on the side. And I also have an RX100 Mark IV to go along with it, so I'm pretty much the Sony guy here, it seems.
Okay, Todd, aside from your Nikon 6006, which you just broke, what are you using these days?
I mostly shoot with a Fuji X-T1. I was a Nikon shooter for years, and I still have my Nikon gear, but I got the Fuji last year and haven't really put it down since.
Okay, and just for myself, I'm predominantly Sony, but I've used Fuji as well. So I think we have a well-balanced group here, and I think the conversation should be pretty fair. Something I think is really important to note is that if you're listening to this and you expect to hear, one brand bashed over another for a definitive winner, that's not going to happen because cameras and photographers are very, very specific. And depending on what you're doing and the way you work, I think determines a great extent what camera system you're going to use, in addition to what attributes they have. Let's talk about things to consider. You have imaging. You have resolution, burst rate, ISO, dynamic range. Okay, let's look at resolution for one thing. Two things we have here, okay? We have Sony, which are full frame, because we're talking about the flagship cameras. We're talking about the A-series cameras, and we're talking about mostly the A7 series cameras. Those are full frame. And then the Fuji cameras are APS-C, which is 50% smaller. Does it make a difference?
No.
I would say yes, but it comes down to personal preference at that point. You can shoot APS-C and get everything you need nowadays, but full frame still has a different look. It's why people still shoot medium format film and 4x5.
That's my take on it also.
Yeah, different formats look different.
Yeah, there's definitely an aesthetic to each format. Not that you can't get close to the aesthetic with the right lens pairing, but it's still not quite the same thing.
Yeah, again, I like full frame, but as far as resolving power and image quality, APS-C is perfectly fine. And anybody who says it isn't, I don't know what their criteria is. ISOs.
ISO is the golden ring that camera manufacturers are chasing these days. I think the resolution thing is still a goal, more megapixels and stuff like that, but it's ISO. High ISO with no or very low noise is what pros seem to be looking for, and amateurs that are in the know are looking for that as well.
Is everybody here satisfied with the low light qualities of whatever camera you're using? Does anybody say, I wish it was more, but or is everybody here okay? I know Sony, you can't argue.
I don't know. I was satisfied with the 5D Mark III years ago, and then Sony came out with the A7S, and I was like, I didn't know what I was missing back then.
That was an eye opener, figuratively and literally. That camera.
Yeah, ISO today is currently what everyone's chasing. Like Todd said, it's different from resolution because once we hit about 20 megapixels, I think everyone stopped complaining about having more pixels and started with just wanting better image quality.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, with the flagship cameras from any system these days, I mean, ISO performance and dynamic range we talked about, I mean, you're never going to be super disappointed, but there's obviously some from brands who put an emphasis on.
I mean, once you get past
like
ISO
Sony, for
50,000, does it make a difference? I mean, seriously. Like the new Nikon comes out with 3 million ISO.
Right.
Why? It's nice to know you can do it, but do you really need it? I don't know if that's such a big deal. So we're all in agreement that ISO is we're there. Well,
I'll say, like, back in the day when I shot the Nikon, the D1X, the D100, the D200, you would kind of cringe inside when you had to go above 400 ISO.
Mm-hmm.
But now there are times where I put the Fuji on auto ISO and I have the ceiling set at 800, knowing that at 800 I can't tell the difference between 800 and 200.
It took me a while to get past the ISO 800 barrier, thinking, oh my God, it's going to be grainy.
Yeah.
And it doesn't. You can't tell the difference anymore.
The Fuji's good to like 1600. I have it set at 800 because at 1600 I think I start to see the noise.
Uh-huh.
And I know at 800 you can't tell. So.
I mean, with my Sony, I'll crank it up sometimes, like 6400 higher, and just let it do its thing. I mean, you're obviously when you go that high, you're gonna see some ramifications to that. But yeah, I'm fully comfortable with 6400.
Dynamic range, we're all happy. Fuji and Sony.
I think they're getting better and better. One thing that I'll take the unpopular view of dynamic range. I think a photograph should look like a photograph. So when I look at a film photo, film has a certain dynamic range, and I don't mind if digital emulates that dynamic range.
Yeah.
I've never been a fan of HDR photography. I don't like your eyes have amazing dynamic range. So I know what my eye sees, but when I see a photograph of that same thing, I expect it to look like a photograph. So if the highlights are blown out or the shadows are dark and black, that's acceptable to me. I'm not looking for extraordinary dynamic range in a digital camera.
I think this might be where we start to see the difference between Fuji and Sony, though, because if you're looking at dynamic range, a lot of it just simply has to do with processing. And with the Fuji X trans, I know support isn't quite there yet compared to Sony and like Canon and Nikon brands, which are very widely supported because of the more traditional Bayer array. Todd, what are your feelings on the X trans support?
I think it's pretty good. I use Lightroom and Photoshop, and I've been able to. I use those lightly. I'm not a heavy Photoshop guy, so I've never run into a wall or like a limitation of the image where I was like, oh, I need to pull more detail out of a section. Hasn't happened. I'm sure there are people that run into those walls regardless of the sensor they're shooting. But I know, like, one of the cool things is I shoot RAW on the Fuji, but I can do the Fuji film simulation in Lightroom during post-processing, which is kind of a cool feature. And I've heard that phase 1 works very well with Fuji. I never have used it, but
yeah, phase 1 actually with Capture One is working with
Capture One's right.
Sony and Fuji a lot better, I think, than Photoshop for Sony files, at least in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to learn it. It's all about just learning how to use the software because it's very different.
Yeah. I've had great experience with Capture One when I've used it. I just feel like it handles at least my Sony files better. I haven't used it with my Fuji files, but that being said, I'm still a Lightroom guy. I just like how Lightroom's oriented.
Right.
Now, here's something to think about also. Color rendition. Each Sony has a color palette. Fuji has a color palette that are very different. And that is some kind of that comes into the equation too. Now, you do a lot of things with in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Just earlier today, we were looking at some of your photographs that are just incredible. Now, those could be fine art or those could be professional, but what made those pictures sing to me, aside from the fact that the scale of what you're photographing is pretty nuts, there was a color palette that just stopped me as I was walking by your desk. You had this image across the screen. It just stopped me. The color was lovely. I know that I could not get that color out of my Sony.
Right. It's surprising. That was something that surprised me going into the Fuji world. It was all of a sudden my night photography was more colorful. And the Nikon the Nikon that I shot for years was good, but the colors didn't pop like they do on the Fuji.
Right.
And that's
with my Sony, I can get anywhere near like just the straight out of camera colors.
Yeah.
That Fuji gives you. Those film simulations, they've worked like long and hard in those things, and they're beautiful. Yeah. I love my Fuji colors.
As much as straight out of camera is nice, is it that critical for a professional though?
I think if you're doing if you're kind of batch processing a bunch of things, you don't want to be making all these Lightroom adjustments. I think having a camera that you know is going to give you kind of the look and aesthetic, at least color-wise, that you're going for, initially.
Back in the day, people chose film based on what the assignment was.
Right.
So it's kind of, you know, now our cameras are almost like your film. Now you could change the simulation stuff, but every camera has a basic look to it.
This is the core question when it comes to picking a camera, I think. If the image quality isn't there, you're not going to use it. Even if you're a professional, you might use like a less well-built camera because it gives you the image quality you need for that job.
Okay.
Now, for art photography, I think it's less important or more important, depending on what you're doing. Because if you have time or you're more methodical, then having perfect image quality isn't necessarily the most important. Also, depending on where you're outputting it. If it's just for you or your Instagram page, you're obviously not going to be as concerned with having 80 megapixels as you are if you're a professional. Anybody else want to?
No, it's true. I mean, shooting with the Sony, every time you take a picture, it's 120 megs. Do you need all that? I personally, I'm not doing billboards. You know, I end up dumbing everything down. Ultimately, it's nice to have all that data there, but do you need it all?
I think there's definitely an application for the high resolution. Like I said, the landscapes, or I mean, obviously it depends on the job, but I would be hesitant to go out into a professional shoot with just a 16 megapixel sensor. I mean, maybe that's just me, but I know the X-Trans, you know, gets you, you know, resolution higher than, you know, 16-ish, you know, gives you that kind of look. But yeah, I don't know. Like, I have to give this one to Sony. I think the image quality you get from that 42 megapixel sensor is just outstanding. And
the resolving power. You can't argue.
You can't
about
argue
that.
with
You can't.
When people talk about 36 megapixels, 42, the thing that goes through my head is my hard drive is going to fill up in a half a day.
Mm-hmm.
My computer is going to choke on these files. I'm going to spend more time in front of the computer. I mean, I started at 5.9 megapixels or 5.7.
3.3.
3.3. I mean, if you open those files on a modern computer, you're like, this is amazing how fast everything is.
Yeah.
And I used to shoot. I shoot the same things I did today with a 16 megapixel Fuji as I did with a 5.7 megapixel Nikon years ago. And I like the photos even more now that I have more megapixels? I'm like, no, I like the photos I shot 10 years ago. I think resolution matters for certain applications. It matters if you're making gigantic prints.
I was just going to say, if you're making prints, now that's
Yeah.
a big consideration. But if what you're doing is ultimately for the web,
Right.
you don't need all of that
No, you
stuff.
need
It's
2
nice to have
megapixels.
it when you're doing the adjustments, when you're playing around with, you know, editing and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you're knocking it down because try uploading 120 megs. It's not going anywhere.
There's also applications for lower resolution. I mean, you need to take a sports photographer, or you got to take a bunch of burst shots. I mean, you can't be taking bursts at 42 megapixels and have your camera kind of keep up with you.
Well, you can. You could do 10 frames a second, then you put the camera down and have a cup of coffee.
Well, yeah. If you like your coffee, that's fine.
You know.
Getting back to image quality, you can take amazing photos with lower megapixel cameras, and you can take amazing ones with higher megapixels. It's just the output, what you want to do with it, that's where the difference is.
So do we feel like there's any sort of correlation between resolution relating to kind of the professional photography versus art photography? Or
I think that there are definitely professionals who need higher resolution, and I think that the fact that Sony offers multiple options depending on what you need kind of puts it ahead of Fuji when it comes to choice for a professional. Because if you need a camera in the studio, you're less concerned about build quality and stuff like that and how it feels, and probably more concerned about how it tethers, and you might need 42 megapixels compared to Fuji's max, which is 24 at the moment.
Right. I personally, I like the fact that Fuji they were all 16 megapixel X-Trans. So the guy standing next to me has the same sensor and a slightly different camera. I didn't feel like I was chasing technology from the Mark 1 to the Mark 2, the Mark 3, or the R to the S or the RS, or, you know, like there's a certain peace of mind you get from having a stable, similar system, I guess.
Okay, Fuji guys, let me ask you a question. Has anybody here ever been out on an assignment? You're with a Fuji or an APS-C camera, and you said, I really wish now I'm not talking about things with selective focus or anything like that, but I'm saying, do you ever felt that you really, really blew it because you didn't have a full-frame camera? You needed that extra sensor size. Did you ever hit anything?
I've never had sensor envy. I have tripod envy. I have tripod head envy, but never sensor. Never have I been out going like, oh, I wish I had a full frame right now.
Now, considering I only shoot with the X100t, with the built-in lens, it's less than an issue. I've never felt like, oh wow, I wish there was a larger sensor inside this camera right now.
But you don't feel that you didn't do the image or the situation justice because you didn't have a larger sensor.
No. not for what I use it for. For mostly street photography. So I've never really felt I needed it.
I embrace the advantages of the smaller sensor with the performance in the lens. I know I get edge-to-edge sharpness on lenses that are traditionally soft on the edges with a full frame camera. There are times I don't have sensor envy, but there's times I'm like, I wish this 28 was actually a 28 millimeter, but it's not today. So I'll have to take a few steps back. I mean, I run into that issue, but the Fuji system, the lenses work incredibly well with the sensors, and you get, when I use my older Nikon glass, or I have a Leica shift lens that I have an adapter, I use it on the Fuji, and I know I can shift that lens all the way, maximum shift, and the corners are still going to be sharp because I have a smaller sensor taking up smaller area in that image circle.
Okay, but let's moving back to the Sony for pros, Fuji for artists. I think we've pretty much decided Sony just has the options.
Right.
And compared to Fuji, if you need a camera that's good in low light or has high resolution, you can find that in Sony.
Oh, yeah,
and if you want full frame, it's there.
Yeah, you look at Fuji, they love kind of making a bunch of different camera bodies and putting the same sensor in them. You know, you look at like the X100t, or you look at the yellow X Pro and the XT1, they're all the same or similar like versions of like the same sensor. Whereas Sony, you have this kind of option, like, oh, we have this, you know, low light 12 megapixel sensor. We have a kind of everyman 24 megapixel sensor, and then we have the 42 megapixel sensor for people who need that resolution.
I think the fact that Fuji's married themselves to the APS-C sensor probably keeps them out of the wish list of a lot of pros. And there is a full frame propaganda going on where there's a they say it's propaganda. It's like you get better pictures with a full frame camera, and I like the fact that their lenses are tailored to that sensor. I like the sensors. I like the size of the camera. I'm very happy, and I like if they decide we're going full frame tomorrow and all the lenses that you bought are going to not work on it, I'll be fairly upset.
So Todd, just moving back to the Fuji for artists, if we're putting them there for the moment in this conversation, why Fuji over a Sony for your personal work? Or
actually, I didn't really analyze image quality when I bought the Fuji. One thing, I like the size of the Fuji. I like the control configuration, the retro controls. And then I've read, wonderful things about the X-Trans sensor and the color rendition, things like that. That's what sold me. I have no issues with the Sony. I just preferred the looks and the feel of the Fuji better.
Okay. It's a personal thing quite often. I tell a lot of people, you're looking at camera, you got to pick it up, you got to look through it and everything else. Yeah. One thing is, we were talking about sensor size. The physical size of the camera bodies really isn't that much different between the two. If you're going from a Fuji to a Sony, it's not going to jolt you because they're physically. I think the Sony might weigh a little bit more, probably have a little bit more heft to it.
A little more heft. And a little more heft. Lenses, especially.
Yeah, definitely.
Talking about Todd, the lenses designed for the system, Fuji definitely has a way more compact lens system.
It's a good collection, too. It's a good collection of good lenses.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you really can't fault them. And the size, I love the manual aperture ring. And to get the good Sony lenses, I mean, the 1.4 lenses, they're kind of big.
We have right here from Sony the 35-1.4 and when the Fuji 35-1.4, and the Fuji's like a third of the size and
at least
weight.
At least
it looks like the Sony can eat 3 of the Fujis.
Exactly. The Sony lens is the garage for the other ones.
Right. we can't forget this is a full frame 35 millimeter lens. Yeah. This is a HSC, but there's still. I mean, if you're looking for that compact like travel photographer, I mean, which I think could border in the realm of professional photography.
Yeah. Sure.
The smaller system, when you're talking about lenses and everything that goes with it, there's definitely a certain appeal to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know we're focusing on the A7s, but I'd like to bring in the A6300 as more of a direct comparison to the Fuji models. It's APS-C, but if you compare the lens lineup between the two cameras,
it's night and day.
Sony's kind of almost forgotten about APS-C in lieu of the new full-frame models.
It's the propaganda.
So if you do need a compact camera system, I personally believe that Fuji kind of has in the bag. They have a lot more in it. It's focused.
From the Sony guy.
Yeah.
I really like the X Pro too for what it is, but I just personally can't use it for what I do professionally.
Okay.
Yeah. What about the X Pro 2 negates it for you in professional use?
Well, I felt that it was just a little lacking on the feel of the body personally, and just video is kind of another huge factor for me.
We're going to come back to that one later. Hold that thought.
Definitely.
Now, here's an interesting thing that we're talking about. You brought up the A6300. I think hands down, if you were to compare that camera to the Fuji's, the Fuji has them hands down as far as ergonomics, construction, just functionality of the
I think you could say
camera.
that about Fuji compared to the A7 series. I think in terms of ergonomics and like how the camera feels, at least in my hand, I think Fuji is just a no-brainer. I personally wish I could get all my Sony A7 features into that Fuji body because I personally think it feels great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree with that. Definitely agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. As far as durability, now, is there a big difference between this Fujifilm and the Sony A7 series cameras? I mean, I know you pick them up, they feel a little bit different, but is there a difference between which one holds up better?
I don't know, Todd. Let's
drop test them?
Let's swap cameras real quick and see how each other feel about them.
I'll drop yours. You don't drop mine.
Justin, what do you think? Since you actively use both.
Well, I mean, I do with my X100t is not necessarily the flagship interchangeable lens cameras we're comparing. It has a lightweight durability to it. It's hard to explain. Like you pick it up, it's not extraordinarily heavy. It's not super lightweight. But it feels good in the hands.
You keep saying weight, lightweight, and everything else, and I think psychologically, when you have something that's lighter, automatically your head says it's not as durable, and I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily true, but there's something to be said about maybe it's just the mentality of picking up something solid and heavy, and you're like, wow, this is gonna outlive me.
But it doesn't mean that it's made as well.
No, not necessarily. The X Pro 2 is, from what I've read, it's got good like weather sealing, and I've seen advertisement pictures of it in the snow. I've never dropped one in the snow. I can't testify to this, but I know if I dropped my A7 in the snow, I'd be freaking out.
Yeah, no choice about. Yeah,
You know what's weird is like over the years, there's been this new emphasis on weatherproofing on cameras, and I think with solid state electronics over the past 30, 40 years, the stuff's pretty durable. Like when I bought that Nikon 6006, they didn't say, oh, it's weatherproofed or it has weather seals, or you just took it out in the rain if you needed to use it in the rain, and it seemed to keep working.
It's a matter of condensation. When I think weatherproofing, okay, again, if moisture gets in between the lens and the body and starts gathering on your sensor, you have a problem.
Right.
So I think that's where it's important. Yeah, it is all solid state. I mean, you could take your memory cards and throw it into a glass of seltzer. It doesn't make any difference. You could, throw it. How many? 3 times already, I've had memory cards go through the laundry. They're fine. Yeah. So that's not to me a big issue.
Were they weatherproof memory cards?
So is weatherproofing much ado about nothing, or is there something to be said?
No, I think it is something. Like I said, it just you don't want the moisture inside because if it starts gathering, all kinds of other things can start gathering in there too.
Definitely important. And looking at the Fuji and the Sony and just feeling the Fuji, like I feel like in terms of weatherproofing, they're probably pretty equal. But one thing that I personally felt more confident in the Sony body just because it was larger. And sometimes it is all about perception.
It's perception.
Right.
Now, Sony, I mean, when you buy an A7 series camera, they give you 2 batteries because they basically know that the thing is just going to, it's like driving a Hummer in traffic. It's
true.
It really, really is. I mean, they just burn. You could watch that dial just go down. I never leave without my home without a spare battery. What about the Fuji? Is that as big an issue? Because I don't have that much experience with Fuji to say whether it's better, worse, or whatever.
Battery life's good. It's not great. It's not as good as a DSLR. The problems with the batteries are smaller in mirrorless cameras because the bodies are smaller. So I carry 4 in my bag. With the Nikon, well, I mean they're small and light, so it's not.
Yeah, it's not a big deal.
I carry about 3 to 4 when I bring my Sony. So
I can use it on a casual week-long vacation. I'm not going to burn through those 4. With the Nikon, if I had 4 batteries, that meant I was going to be away from electricity for a week and a half.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
So you go through them fast. It's not.
Sounds like they're pretty even.
Yeah, I don't think one has a clear advantage. But
you need to bring a pouch of batteries with you.
Nobody's leaving the house with 1 battery. That's the bottom line.
No, I have 2.
Okay,
Yeah.
At least 2.
One
right.
charging right now.
We're going to take a short break and come back with more on Fujifilm and Sony cameras, art and professional.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. Send us a tweet at BHPhotoVideo, #BHPhotoPodcast.
Okay, we are back. Function speed between Sony and Fujifilm. Anybody have any thoughts about that? I'm sure you do. I know.
Well, I can't.
We start. I think everyone agrees that we wish they would start up a little bit quicker.
Right.
That's a
I
given.
can't speak for the XT1 or the X Pro 2, but when I've started my Sony, there's a little wait time, and I'm not saying it's long, but like it could be faster.
Get
I
a
want
cup
to turn
of
my camera
coffee.
on. And I want to turn my camera on. I want it to be on.
Yeah,
I
it's
want to.
not as fast as the 5Gs I've used before. But I don't think it's that bad anymore. Sony has definitely
terrible, but-
definitely supported it. In firmware updates, they've made it way faster.
Yeah, they've acknowledged that it was a little bit too long. They're working on it.
I think the both cameras start up fairly fast, not as fast as DSLRs, but the Sony embraced the PASM interface, so in the command dial, the front and rear command dial, so it's much more of a familiar platform to DSLR shooters. The Fuji went way back with aperture ring on the lens, dials on top, a little bit of a slower interface.
So like you're talking about like shooting now, like a shooting style. It's going to take a little longer to get your settings set. And,
Yeah.
So the Sony's faster, pretty much, when it comes to operation.
And I think for quote unquote pro shooters, that speed is essential in a lot of ways.
What about burst rates? I know we keep saying professionals. Depending on what you're doing, burst rate's enough for you right now? I mean, what about between? I'm familiar with the Sony. What about the Fuji?
Fuji has 8 frames per second, which is pretty maddeningly fast, but it's.
And that's for how many frames? Is it a burst and then it goes to sleep for a while, or
usually
can you keep going?
I haven't held my finger on the trigger at 8 frames per second for too long, because in my head I'm like, this is going to be a very long editing process.
True. Okay, all right. But
I'm
assuming
sure
you're in a situation where you needed that just
right
long burst.
I think it has a fairly big buffer. I don't know the stats. I mean, we can try it out right now.
Okay.
All right, well, Todd plays around with his Fuji. Sean, you shoot a lot with the A7R2. Probably more so than I do. What are your opinions on burst? What is it, five frames a second?
Did you hear it started slowing
That
down?
was good.
All the A7s are 5 frames per second, which is a little slow if we're talking about your sports shooters and stuff like that. But if you got to bring in the A6300 this conversation, which has 11 frames per second. It's only APS-C, but sometimes sports shooters are fine with APS-C models.
Gives you the extra reach too with your lenses.
Now, is that a burst and then it goes to sleep, or can you keep going? Like, because Todd just went through it, he just kept going, and I don't know if you can barely hear that in the
I
background.
got
but
close
it
to
was going.
50 shots there.
All right, 50 shots in a burst. Now, that's not too shabby. Now, with the A6300, you'll give you that 11 frames per second. What does it do after that? Does it just sort of like
Back when I
lay
had
down?
an A6000, it was usually pretty good for at least a couple seconds. Can't really say too much about the A6300 since I haven't had extensive time with it, but I think it's pretty good. A lot of sports shooters have come out and said using the A6300, I know Sony's been promoting a lot of artisans that are using the A6300 exclusively for football and stuff like that. So it's definitely being used. Now, if we're also talking about like burst rates and sports shooters, we have to bring in autofocus. And I think Sony with the A7R and A6300, which 399 and 425 phase detect points respectively.
Yeah.
It's
Excellent
impressive.
point. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
a lot of people have a lot of good things to say about the Sony autofocus, and I personally just bought my first native Sony lens for my camera, so I've actually been testing it out last night, and
So excited.
I know, I'm super excited. I finally committed. I finally committed to the Sony system. It's impressive. The eye tracking, it's nice.
I have to agree. All of my own lenses that I use in Sony are all manual focus lenses, but I recently had a Sony lens on there, and yeah, it was very impressive. But it just extremely responsive. It was dead on, also very, very accurate. I can't complain about it at all.
Todd, how's your Fuji?
It's good. I mean, the Fuji advertises very quick autofocus. The numbers are really good. I find that it's not as quick as a DSLR. I mean, I chased a 2-year-old around with the camera, and I would have gotten more hits than misses on a DSLR. I think on the Fuji it was about half and half. But I know Sony definitely, their marketing plays to that speed and the autofocus system and the tracking and things like that.
So if someone's going to weigh their options to say, okay, I can get, maybe more confident autofocusing, maybe a little faster, slower burst rates, or with the Fuji, which autofocus sounds pretty decent.
Yeah.
Maybe not quite as good, and then faster bursts. I mean, is that a discussion, or is it someone just going to say, is it irrelevant? Is someone just like, oh, well, I think it's relevant. I need this burst. I need this autofocus.
It's relevant for certain people for whatever they're shooting. If you're doing sports and action, I think the Sony has the advantage there.
Yeah, because you got to hit the shot. If you take 8 out of focus shots, it doesn't matter.
Right. If you get like four or five, usable shots, that's better than.
Yeah.
Going back to the function speed of a camera, we talked about autofocus. We've talked about kind of bursts, but we talk about buffering, because Sony offers some pretty high resolution options. The A7R2, 42 megapixels. I mean, you taking 10 shots or so. Like, what's the wait time here? I mean, I know
I've noticed that you have to use fast cards. I found myself in a few situations where I'm shooting and it's like, come on, let's go. Come on.
You're missing opportunities to shoot if the longer you're waiting.
If you're not a sports shooter, though, and you're not professionally making money on all your work and you don't need the speed, I think Fuji has a great system with their design, though.
Right, totally.
Because you were mentioning it earlier, how they have all the physical dials.
Yeah.
You think it out. It's a process.
Right.
Back with like the film days where you had to choose every setting, pick your film even.
Forget the sensor, forget the sensor size, forget X-Trans, all that. Just the control layout makes taking a photograph more of a process. And sometimes the pro shooter doesn't want it to be a process. They want it to be automatic. But if you're putting more thought into your photography, I hate to say that, like to discount a sports shooter not having thought. Obviously they do, but the speed is the essence. But if you are going to be more deliberate about your photography in some ways, the old school manual control layout kind of walks you to that place.
I agree.
I agree. I think that's what really makes Fuji appeal to sort of the art photographers, if you will, the street photographers, the kind of the deliberate photographers who are taking the time to make those adjustments.
Yeah, Justin, you have an X100t. Like, you've been talking about that earlier. Like, you don't take it on pro jobs, but like that. What do you use it for?
If I'm making like pictures for myself, then it's usually the camera I grab. Yeah, it's just a fixed lens, and if I need interchangeable lens, I'll grab the Sony. But if I'm heading out for pretty much any other purpose, I will grab the Fuji, just because it not only makes me want to shoot, it makes me more confident that I'm shooting for like a reason rather than just looking a camera around. The
expression for taking pictures for yourself, I think that's really important, and that's a differentiator between a tool and something that helps you with your art.
How influenced are we by what the manufacturers are branding these things for? I stay kind of blind to that. I go for the tool, and honestly, I could use any camera to do fine art or professional, assuming it's a reliable camera. Are we being influenced by that stuff? I mean, I think a lot of people are.
I think definitely. It's hard for us because we read spec sheets all day long, so we know them inside
surrounded by it.
But I think if you're just flipping through a magazine, like I know Sony has their own like magazine with Pop Photo that is just dedicated entirely to them. They have professionals talking about professional jobs, locations, shoots they actually went on. And another advantage that Sony seems to have nowadays is Zeiss. They're working very closely with Zeiss to produce lenses, and Zeiss puts on their like full page ads. They put Batis pro lenses for a pro system, like stuff like that. And I think if you see big names like Zeiss and Sony working together on, and they're saying the A7s, these lenses, pro camera, you see that.
Yeah,
I think it's interesting. I think if you look at some of the photographers that are kind of like sponsored by Sony or Fuji, you look at like the Fuji X shooters or whatever they call themselves, and you see, I look at those and I look through the work, and it's more street photography. It's more the kind of what we would call more fine art, I guess, more art photography. And Sony, you see a lot of these National Geographic shooters sort of switching over to mirrorless. You see
sports all the time.
Yeah. So you see, I mean, if we're making that distinction between art and sports, I mean, just look at the shooters they're promoting.
For amateur photographers getting in the business, they're highly influenced by what they see on the sidelines of a sports game or what the White House photographer uses, and or if they dig deeper, their favorite type of street shooter or something.
Good points. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the system components of these cameras.
If you'd like to reach out to us with your questions or comments, email us at podcast@bhphoto.com.
Okay, we are back. We've been touching on lenses on and off here, but let's talk a little bit more about that. We have two camera systems. We have the Sonys and we have the Fujifilms, and we're talking about for professionals, we're talking about for artists. Each of these camera brands has their own line of lenses. Does Sony appeal more to professionals?
I definitely think Sony, at least while they're fairly new compared to Fuji, at least full frame, they're definitely giving people what they want, as we've seen with the latest G Masters, where they delivered 3 lenses that everybody's been asking for.
Yep.
They're super fast 85, 2470 2.8, and a 7200 2.8, which we've yet to see, but it's on its way. And I think just the fact that they are delivering lenses that people want and are asking for, especially professionals wanting those 2.8 zooms, it's huge for pros.
There's also good support. I mean, obviously the partnership with Zeiss, but I mean, Zeiss making, like you said, the bodice lenses, having these high quality like autofocus primes, Zeiss primes for the Sony system. Yeah, you have what are the APS-C Zeiss lenses?
The 2.8s?
Yeah, you have those for the Fuji system, but I mean, those bodice lenses are.
Do you think the
something.
manufacturers take it more seriously for the full frame cameras as opposed to the APS-C? The way you just said, yeah, they make the baddest for the two.
I may have a little snarky remark there, yeah.
No, seriously, do you think the manufacturers have that same thing going on in their minds, that the people who are using these cameras aren't as serious as anybody's buying a full frame?
Well, I obviously can't speak for Zeiss, but when I look at what Fuji is doing with their lenses, and I mean, they're very, very good lenses, very well-respected lenses. People say great things about these Fuji lenses, and rightly so. They have such a solid, complete set of lenses at this point, where I feel like Sony is a bit more patchwork still. They're coming out with this and that people need this, people need that. You have some.
I think some people get confused. Yeah, some people get confused because of these different tiers.
Yeah.
But then again, Canon does the same thing. They have they have 3 different tiers of lenses. Topping off with the L series. Nikon does the same thing, and all of them do that. So I
feel like Sony's still kind of piecing together their lower end. Like they're kind of 1/8.
I think you'd struggle to find a lens that you didn't if you needed a lens, I think Sony kind of has it figured out now. I think you could find a lens if you needed a lens. I don't think there's anything directly missing at this point.
No, I feel pretty much the same way. I agree with you on that.
I think we've talked about it before. I think the Sony system was a little slow in getting their lens battery built up. And they've definitely caught up now, or they're almost there.
Early on. It was a desert.
They had a huge focus on zooms, and it was, I won't say they were lower end, but that was definitely their bread and butter at the time. But now they're moving towards more professional lenses. Their partnership with Zeiss is giving you phenomenal glass. It comes at a cost, but you have it.
I think for companies like Zeiss being involved with full frame and APS-C, I think they just found, if you're selling a lens that's over $1,000, you're going to be marketing more to pros, and I think more pros tend to gravitate towards the A7s because they're full frame. So if we're talking about lenses in that way, I think the lens selection and third-party lens selection that's being offered now, Sony has a great options all across the board.
So you think for the professional will lean towards the Sony for lens choice over a Fuji?
I think so. Today,
at least. I think so, especially with the big telephotos, the 2.8s and stuff. I think, I can't speak for Fuji, but when you looked at their lens roadmap, their focus was on high quality primes and some very good, useful zooms, but not blowing, the equivalent 70 to 200 2.8 exists with Fuji, but it's not really known for the sports shooter.
If you're a fine artist, and you're working on an art-related project, whatever that might be, and again, that is such a broad subject. I mean, it gets a little bit gray.
Is photography art?
That's for another show. No, seriously, but say you're about to embark on a large fine art project, and you have to choose a system based on the lenses. And again, we don't know what the project's about. Who do you think has a better set of offerings? Would it be Fuji? Would it be Sony?
That's tough.
Real tough, yeah.
It might be pretty close.
Fuji makes excellent glass. It's not really talked about that much, but they make excellent glass, and they've been making it for years for APS-C exclusively. So I
had Fujinon lenses on my 4x5 camera, and they were exquisite. Really were.
Fuji goes back a long ways. And
their medium format cameras were terrific.
If you're going to pair just APS-C systems, I think it's again, it's night and day. I mean, Fuji has the offerings where Sony is
They also have some interesting stuff in there right now with like the 56 with the apodization filter.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Yeah.
They're making unique lenses that if you need a very specific thing for your project, you might be better off with the Fuji.
And they give you these nice compact like F2s now, the 35 F2,
Right.
the water resistant one. I mean, they're coming out with, again, these series of water resistant. I think we're going to see more of those come out now, especially kind of the smaller lenses might be better for that kind of X Pro 2 form factor too. So
They're kind of set on all the basic lenses. So they even have a bunch of the like lower end zooms if you're just starting out.
Right. The Fuji primes are blow my Nikon primes out of the water when I compare them back to back, which it's painful to say that because I thought I had the world's sharpest Nikon 51.8.
We all did before Fuji and Sony came to the scene. Yes.
And that, like when I have the Fuji 90 and the Nikon 105 DC, which is a legendary lens.
Yeah.
I haven't really used that 105 DC since.
What about flashes? And I know there's going to be a little bit of an easier discussion right here as far as flashes between Sony and Fuji.
Fuji's playing catch up. They're getting there, but high speed sync we didn't even see until the X Pro 2, which a lot of pros ask for, and they have no radio system in work at all that we know about. And their top flagship flash right now is 42 meter guide number, which is pretty low comparatively. And the one that they have coming is still coming. The XF5000, which they talked about a couple months back, and I think it ended up being delayed because of the earthquake and other goings on.
Yeah.
So they're still playing catch up. Sony had some time, and I use actually a couple of their speed lights. They're nice, and they come back from the A system, so the original Alpha SLT DSLR hybrid system, and they're good. They work. They have all the features you would expect, and they just announced a couple months ago that they're working on a Sony radio system, so you can use those.
I think they have to, because especially if they're chasing the pro market, no two ways about it. And I think flash plays into the fine art market too, again, depending on what you're doing. But for professionals, I think if you're choosing a system, that's definitely part of it. It has to be.
Yeah,
Definitely.
from what I've heard, Sony has a definite advantage on flash. I will say this in defense of the Fuji. The XT1 comes with this tiny little flash, which looks like something you wouldn't take seriously. But I've done some event photography with it, and it nails everything I ask it to do. I used to shoot, like I had a speed light for my Nikon years ago, could never get a good shot. It was either blowing out stuff or not powerful enough. Pop-up flashes, you get the shadowing from the lens. Yeah. That little Fuji flash, I put it on aperture priority, and I go around shooting, and the color, the amount of lighting it's putting out, everything is wonderful.
Yeah, let's
awesome.
discuss that. Fuji kind of makes their flash system. It's tiny, it's compact, and talking about more art type, street photography, stuff like that, where you want a more compact system, especially looking at the X Pro 2, which has that rangefinder style.
Yeah,
they're appealing directly to that audience, the more like art, like methodical approach audience.
Trying to capture the people who can't afford Leicas.
Yeah. Also,
it's funny. We kind of joke about that, but when you pick up an X Pro 2 and you look through that viewfinder and you play, you switch from electronic to optical, you're like, I bet there's people at Leica going like, man, I wish we had this viewfinder.
Yes.
I think
it's pretty
mirrorless in general. Like I think, I love an optical viewfinder, and the fact that Fuji actually gives you a mirrorless camera with that optical viewfinder option, and can just switch over to electronic. I mean, you can't fault that mindset.
No,
and
it's pretty amazing.
It's one of the reasons why I own an A7R2, and I still want an X Pro 2. Like I would buy one just to basically replace my X100. I would just carry 3 cameras around if I had to.
Yeah,
that's what they're hoping for. That's why
they might get what they want.
You look at the Fuji, the X Pro 1 came out. It was patterned after the classic rangefinder camera, which is not this. It's not a sports photo machine with a honkin' telephoto. It's for the street shooter, it's for the vacation shooter, it's for it's for the quote unquote fine artist, the Bressans of the world.
You're not going to see Leica like at a sports event, but no one's going to say Leica's not a professional system.
Right.
So.
Exactly. So, but that was their target market. The XT1 is a little more of a DSLR look to it, but it still has the manual control, so that it's still that customer base where they want the methodical, thoughtful shooter.
The fine art guys.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a pro, you need tethering. Okay.
You don't need it, but
yeah.
Well, the truth of the matter is, depends what you're doing.
People who want it need it. I used the A7R2 tethered a couple times. It's really nice, and they have a great relationship with the Capture One from Phase One.
Right.
And that software is pretty much the de facto standard for tethering in professional environments. So you can't really compete with that.
The XT1 tethers, but the X Pro 2 does not, and a lot of people are upset about that.
The X Pro 2 isn't really designed for that kind of setup, though.
It's not. It's not. No, definitely not.
When I say people are complaining, there's one guy online I read article yesterday.
But it goes right back into like what Todd, you were explaining, and how the system's smaller. Right. It's designed for people on the ground, like on the street, doing that kind of shooting.
Yeah. It's not a studio machine.
And grips?
I think both. I know Fuji has a whole line of expandable grips, different sizes and stuff. I have one that has an Arca plate at the bottom, and it just gives you a nice feel. I don't have it on right now, but
yeah, I know Sean used one, and I use one as well. I feel it's almost a necessity for these mirrorless cameras. I mean, you need to have your pinky on the camera somewhere, and the bodies are just not tall enough to get your whole hand on them.
You have that Arca style grip, and I picked up. I didn't realize that you had it on there. It's just another 1/4 of an inch, but it made a difference for me.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, with a small lens, maybe if I'm adapting my Voigtlander 40mm to my camera, yeah, maybe I don't need it. But like anything else where it's gonna have even any sort of front weight, like, it's basically unholdable.
Yeah, both systems have battery grips though. So
yeah, both do.
You can get them. Justin, you just picked up.
I just bought one yesterday.
So how does it feel like, especially with the lens selection on the
It feels
Sony?
great. Like I said earlier, I just bought the 70-200 f4, and yeah, I couldn't imagine using it without the battery grip. It makes the camera look a little funky. It looks kind of like a square now, but it gets the job done.
So far, we've been talking a lot about, when we're talking about lenses, we're talking about the Fuji lenses and Sony lenses. But one of the beautiful things about mirrorless cameras is that you can put other people's glass onto your camera bodies. My take on it as far as adapters is that I think it's kind of a wash as far as which system would be better, regardless of whether you're doing pro or art. To me, I think it's a wash as far as your options, right?
You might have to give Sony the edge because the electronic adapters are just taking off right now. Metabones basically started everything with a Canon EF to Sony E adapter.
Yeah, okay.
And that was huge.
They got a lot of people that switch systems or question like, okay, well, I can switch into this Sony system and keep my whole like archive of glass. I mean, that's
And now we're seeing even Nikon adapters are showing up now too. So I think the Sony infrastructure is just more friendly to adapting lenses, and Sony themselves talk about it.
I'll say this. I think Sony has the advantage as well because the full frame sensor, people have their wide angle prime that they use for years. Now they can use on their Sony. If you put it on the Fuji, you can use it depending on the lens, but you're not going to get that same field of view.
Well, it depends how wide that lens is now.
Right.
That's another issue. Has anybody heard any rumors or anything about Fuji adapters with autofocus capability? Is anyone talking about that? I haven't seen anything.
I haven't heard anything. No,
I just don't think the market's big enough, considering
that was
where
my next question.
Most of these adapters are coming from.
Yeah, I feel like people. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I feel like people going to the Fuji system, man. Like part of the reason they're doing it is for those Fuji lenses. So if I'm going to the system, maybe I'll adapt some like
Justin,
Voigtlanders or something.
You got a Fuji camera that only has the one.
It's only got the one lens, so it gets the job done. But yeah, if I was going to an XT1, X Pro 2, like I would buy an archive of lenses. Yeah,
I'll say that like with focus peaking, manual focusing on the Fuji is a pleasure. And if you have a lens with a nice focus feel, it's like like I don't want autofocus at that point.
Wi-Fi.
Who cares?
Well, some people do.
Some people do.
I actually use it extensively.
He does. He cares.
Obviously, both systems have it, so it's kind of a
wash.
Kind of a wash. I mean, I find the Sony the Wi-Fi app, the smartphone app, slightly more intuitive than the Fuji, but they're about the same thing.
Really curious to hear that somebody who's used both finds the Fuji even more complicated or less intuitive.
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty close, but something about the Sony, I know, I just like dealing with it.
I've only used the Fuji has a capability. I've used it to play with it, and I've used it. Actually, did a architectural shoot where I was working with the interior designer, and I handed her my iPad and said, "This is what," and she could see what I was seeing in the camera, and that was a pretty cool experience. But the Sony does that too, so there's no advantage. It's a cool function. something I rarely use. If it wasn't in the camera, it wouldn't keep me from buying it.
Yeah, see, I rarely use the Wi-Fi with the Sony these days because I do walk around with the Fuji, and that's the camera I'm taking a snap, and I'm taking the JPEG, the beautiful JPEG that Fuji gives me, and I'll just put it straight to Instagram. No, no, nothing, just
because he's that good.
Because I'm that good. You can follow me on Twitter.
I know
and Instagram.
I'm a little bit ignorant on this one. Does a Fuji have a silent mode? Because my Sony does, and I use it at all.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have a wash here. Now, again, that could be for professional or for fine art, right?
Yep.
So we're both okay on that whole thing. LCDs, I think we're kind of equal on that. They
LCDs
are
are
what they
LCDs.
Yeah.
They've gotten bigger and better over the years.
They can always be better and bigger.
Yeah, well,
maybe not bigger.
No, yeah. But even still, I think once we crack like the 1 million dot mark, I mean, they're brilliant. They're wonderful to use. It's like looking through a little window. I have no problems with them at all. What haven't we touched on yet as far as these cameras? And again, let's go back. The topic is, fine art versus professional. And again, there's a lot of overlap and blur here, but what didn't we touch on?
I think there's one major thing that we didn't really touch on, and I know it's huge for me and Justin, is a video.
Absolutely. Yes.
Justin and I think both of us made our decisions on what cameras to use and picking up a Sony specifically because it gave us both stills and extremely good video.
Extremely
I was coming
video,
over from when I first switched to Sony with the A7S. I had always been more of a primarily video shooter, and photography kind of it's a growing desire for me, but video is still first and foremost. And I was coming over from a Nikon D600. Was video. I'm not gonna get into that, but it just wasn't good enough for me.
It was good at that time.
Yeah, it was good at that time. But the Sony is just obviously just miles away from what Fuji can do. When you look at 4K internal recording, you look at S-Log2 gamma.
What?
So yeah, Todd's over here like, what does that mean?
It's a fine art term.
I mean, it gives the professional or semi-professional videographer the tools that they need, really.
And it's 4K. So
4K.
Fuji doesn't have that yet. So
are there rumors for Fuji? Have you heard anything at all?
There are rumors, but we'll have to wait and see. I think we'll probably see something this year with the replacement of the XT1, which is getting a little old, to follow up the X Pro 2, but I don't know.
My guess is within a year or two, maybe 3 tops, everybody will have 4K. I remember when it was a big deal going to 1080p, and that's a yawn.
I don't think, I just don't know if Fuji cares, for lack of a better term.
Well, the thing is their market need it. The people who are, I'm sure they talk, well, I shouldn't say I'm sure, but does the person who buys a Fuji care about that?
I think there's that mindset. There's the fine art photographer mindset who's almost like, I don't even need video on my camera.
Right.
Like, why is it even there?
Nikon
why does it
DF,
exist at all?
Perfect example. Nikon released a camera that just looks retro styled, like almost like an F, and just no video.
But I think
everybody loved it.
Yeah, there's professional shooters, hybrid shooters who video is becoming more and more essential for them. So
yeah, a lot of pros today shoot stills and video. So if you're going to do that, you're going to lean towards Sony over Fuji. With Fuji, it's not that they don't care about video, but that's not an emphasis. And their lens lineup is not built for video either. Like the aperture rings click. This 35-1.4, the autofocus motor is, I wouldn't say it's noisy, but you definitely wouldn't want it be shooting video with that thing.
Okay. We could probably go on all day long about this. And as I said up front, I don't know if there's a definitive answer. Personally speaking, I use a Sony. And I use it for fine art, and I use it for professional work.
And he wishes he had a Fuji.
After seeing the color on the screen from those ships that you were doing, yes, there's definitely something to be said about that. No two ways about it. And again, we do have a constantly evolving world out here of imaging. I think if we were to step back 2 years and even project what we're talking about today, I don't know if we'd half believe that this is actually going to be happening. So a lot of what we discussed today could be just null and void a year from now, 6 months from now. But for the state of the art where we are right now, I think we pretty much covered a lot of things. As far as what's the best camera, is Fujifilm for artists and Sony is for pros.
Let's ask the panel.
Hey, so what do you think?
I'm going to say yes.
I think I'm in agreement.
I would agree, yeah. But the caveat is I'm happy that Fuji's for artists, and I consider myself a visual artist, and that's the machine I want to use.
Well, I'm happy that the Sony's for professionals.
because Sean's a pro.
I'm happy that I have both.
Well, as somebody who shoots with a Sony A7 series camera since they've been out already, I love the camera, and I will tell you that working here at B&H and doing a lot of camera reviews, I've never been disappointed by a Fuji. And in fact, I have a lot of keepers and photographs that I really do cherish that I've shot with the Fujis. So there you have
Awesome.
it. Okay.
That's where it's at.
Sean, Justin, and Todd, thank you so much for joining us today. If you like what you hear, post a review on iTunes. Send us a tweet at BHPhotoVideo with the hashtag BHPhotoPodcast. And as always, thank you so much for tuning in.